Einen schönen guten Abend und herzlich willkommen zu diesem besonderen Abend einer gemeinsamen Veranstaltung der Deutschen Kommission Justitia et Pax und der Katholischen Akademie. Mein Name ist Jörg Lühr, ich bin der Geschäftsführer der Deutschen Kommission Justitia et Pax und habe das Vergnügen, diesen Abend zu moderieren und uns ein wenig dadurch zu führen. Die katholische Kirche und die Sklaverei. Ein verdrängtes Kapitel Kirchengeschichte zwischen Beteiligung, Leugnung und Widerstand. Wie kommt es zu einer solchen Veranstaltung? Die Deutsche Kommission Justitia et Pax, eine Einrichtung der Bischofskonferenz und des Zentralkomitees der deutschen Katholiken, gleichzeitig Teil eines weltweiten Netzwerkes von Justitia et Pax Kommissionen in fast jedem Land der Welt, mit einem zugehörigen Dikasterium in Rom, befasst sich seit einigen Jahren intensiv mit der Frage des Umgangs mit dem kolonialen Erbe, Colonial Heritage. Das ist so in Deutschland eine der noch unter bestimmten Fragen. Und wenn man sich damit befasst, kommt man früher oder später notwendigerweise zum Thema der Sklaverei. Und Sklaverei wirklich als eine der Stellen, wo die europäische Geschichte und damit auch andere, ich sag mal salopp, falsch abgebogen sind. Mit immensen Auswirkungen bis heute. Wir haben im letzten Jahr gemeinsam mit unseren Partnern in Ghana eine Tagung gemacht in Elmina, einem der großen ehemaligen Sklavenforts in Ghana. Ghana war das Silicon Valley des transatlantischen Sklavenhandels. Eine Tagung gemacht mit Partnern aus Afrika, den Amerikas und Europa, genau zur Frage Umgang mit der Sklaverei und der Bedeutung der Folgen der Sklaverei heute. Father Kellerman, wegen dem Sie heute zu Recht hier sind, hat damals einen hochbemerkenswerten Vortrag gehalten, eben zur Rolle der katholischen Kirche in diesem Prozess. Aber jenseits des historischen Wissens, ich bin Historiker, ich könnte mich da in solchen Details suhlen, aber hier geht es um was ganz anderes. Jenseits des historischen Wissens ist die Frage der tiefen Verwundung unserer Gesellschaften, das, was einem entgegenschlägt, geradezu in einer Begegnung an diesem Ort. Und wir werden vielleicht im Laufe des Gesprächs auch noch drauf kommen. Für mich war eine der großen Einsichten auf dieser Tagung, wie tief die Verletzungen gerade bei unseren afroamerikanischen Freunden sind und eine Art von Verletzungen, die wir um unserer selbst willen nicht ignorieren dürfen. Das heißt, wir müssen was tun. Und Teil des Problems ist die Rolle der katholischen Kirche in dem Ganzen. Und wenn man etwas näher gräbt, und Father Kellerman wird uns dort gleich tief und profund einführen, stellt man fest, wie sehr wir als katholische Kirche Teil des Systems gewesen sind. Der Ablauf des heutigen Abends wird wie folgt aussehen. Sie haben das Vergnügen, ungefähr 45 Minuten einem Vortrag von Father Kellerman zu lauschen. Ich freue mich jetzt schon drauf, muss ich ganz ehrlich sagen. Das wird sehr intensiv. Danach werden wir gemeinsam mit Erzbischof Dr. Udo Benz hier ein Gespräch führen und dem nachspüren. Was bedeutet das? Wofür steht das, was wir gehört haben? Und was könnten Antworten sein, Antwortmöglichkeiten, die uns zur Verfügung stehen? Und wenn wir dann noch Zeit haben, dann werden wir vielleicht noch die Möglichkeit eröffnen, dass wir insgesamt hier in diesem Raum miteinander ins Gespräch kommen. Wenn nicht, haben wir definitiv hinterher natürlich die Gelegenheit, beim Wein noch miteinander zu sprechen. Erlauben Sie mir, Ihnen kurz ein paar Worte zu Christopher Kellerman zu sagen. Sie haben es schon gesehen, er ist Jesuit. Das ist in diesem Fall ein großer Vorteil. Denn es ist oftmals, eigentlich fast immer ein großer Vorteil, aber in diesem Fall ist es ganz besonders ein Vorteil, weil die Jesuiten zum einen als weltumspannende Formation das Problem der Sklaverei innerhalb ihres Ordens hatten, zum anderen aber auch genau innerhalb dieser Organisation Möglichkeiten bereitstellen, sich mit diesen Fragen auseinanderzusetzen. Father Kellerman hat dieses Buch geschrieben. Keine Sorge, ich mache jetzt hier nicht den Buchhändler, aber Sie sollten zumindest einmal dieses bemerkenswerte Buch gesehen haben, All Oppression Shall Cease. Und hier geht es eben genau um die Frage, die wir heute Abend diskutieren würden. Father Kellerman hat eine typisch jesuitische, lange Biografie von Texas, wo er herkommt, nach Washington, nach Denver, nach Kanada, verschiedene Positionen, wie Ignatius empfiehlt, immer mit leichtem Gepäck, aber immer on the spot. Heute ist er der hauptverantwortliche, ich sag's mal so, Lobbyist für Social Justice and Ecology in Washington, D.C. Das ist vielleicht nicht direkt nur Freude, die einen da ankommt, unter den jetzigen Bedingungen auf dem Capitol Hill zu arbeiten. Aber umso wichtiger, Father Kellerman ist es gewohnt, in den harten Gräben des öffentlichen Diskurses seine Punkte zu machen. Christopher, herzlich willkommen. Wir freuen uns sehr, dass du den Weg über den Atlantik geschafft hast, um hier mit uns heute ein paar Einsichten zu teilen. Nicht weniger herzlich der Vorsitzende der Deutschen Kommission Justitia et Pax, für den das gewissermaßen ein Heimspiel ist, Erzbischof Dr. Udo Markus Benz aus Paderborn. Erzbischof Benz zeichnet sich nicht allein durch seine Kapazität als Vorsitzender der Kommission aus, sondern er ist seit mittlerweile einigen Jahren auch der Vorsitzende der Unterkommission der Bischofskonferenz für den Nahen und Mittleren Osten. Warum ist das relevant? Weil man in diesen Zusammenhängen ein Gespür dafür entwickelt, wie lang anhaltend geschichtliche Verletzungen sein können. Dass wir, wenn wir von Geschichte reden, wir eigentlich von der Gegenwart sprechen und wir die Geschichte benötigen, um das, was heute geschieht, überhaupt nur einigermaßen erfassen zu können. Auch das ist für uns ein großes Geschenk, Sie mit diesen Erfahrungen hier zu haben. Und ich freue mich auf das Gespräch. Und jetzt freue ich mich erst einmal auf deinen Vortrag, Christopher. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Jörg, and thank you to the Catholic Academy for sponsoring this event, and thank you to all of you for being here this evening. I want to start with this image, an image that's very familiar to Jörg and I. This is the castle at Elmina on the coast of Ghana of a slave trading fort, And we were there together in September to have this conference. And in the middle of the fort, right in the middle of it, is the former structure of a Catholic church, the Catholic chapel that was put there by the Portuguese who were building this fort. So right in the middle of slave dungeons, here is the Catholic chapel. That's one image I want to begin with. And I also want to begin with a little bit of data. In the year 1760 alone, just in the year 1760, the Society of Jesus, my religious order, owned over 20,000 human beings as slaves. Over 20,000. And notice here, the very, very bottom that says England, Maryland Farms, that's the United States. We had 192 slaves the U.S. Jesuits did at that time. You may have heard of the Georgetown Jesuits and the slaves that were sold there. Notice how small that is compared to the Society of Jesus in Brazil, over 5,000. In Peru, over 3,000. France, Quito, Chile. And this is only in 1 year, right? Only in 1 year. So the question is, how did this happen? How did this happen? And to understand that, we have to go back, way back in time, and talk a little bit about slavery in the ancient world. In the ancient world, slavery is very widespread, and we see it in the Old Testament, in the Hebrew Scriptures, right? Abraham is a slave holder. Abraham and Sarah are slaveholders, and they use Hagar, their slave, as property, as sexual property. We see in the law of Moses certain regulations for slavery, and there's a separate set of regulations for a Hebrew who becomes enslaved to another Hebrew versus legislation for a foreigner who becomes enslaved to a Hebrew. And the protections for the foreigner are almost none. And they are to be owned perpetually and passed down from generation to generation. Now, there were different theories for why slavery exists in the ancient world. In the Old Testament, we see it as, to some extent, as a result of sin, with the story of the first time slavery is mentioned is when Noah curses his grandson, Canaan, with slavery because Ham, Canaan's father, uncovers the nakedness of Noah after the flood. So maybe we get a sense that because of sin, slavery exists in the world. Aristotle has this theory that some people are naturally built to be slaves. Their bodies and their minds, they show us that they're meant to be slaves. The way that he described it is that maybe they have very strong bodies and maybe in fact they're smart, but they don't have a lot of energy, they don't have a lot of will to fight back. And he says, so these are natural slaves. In the Roman Empire, the philosophers and legislators of the time completely disagree with this. They say there's no one who is naturally built to be a slave. We are all by nature free. But people become slaves. And Rome is just fine with that. And there are 3 ways in the Roman Empire that someone can become enslaved to a Roman. Okay? A Roman can never become a slave. It is illegal. It is impossible. And not just Roman citizens. Anyone who is free in Rome can never become a slave. That is a big part of their law. But there's 3 ways in which a foreigner can become enslaved to a Roman. The first is capture during war. The second, being born to an enslaved mother. That automatically makes you a slave. We see this in the Hebrew Scriptures as well. That's also part of the Hebrew law. And let's say that a Roman soldier is, off on a campaign and wants to purchase a foreigner from another slave trading port. You can do that, bring them back. So these are the 3 ways that someone in Roman law, in the Roman Empire, can become a slave. And that is the context for slavery in the New Testament. So any time in the New Testament that you come upon an enslaved person, a slave, you can be sure that it is someone who was either captured during war, someone who was born to an enslaved mother, or someone who was purchased from a foreign merchant. So in Paul, or in the letters of Paul and Peter, where they say, slaves, obey your masters as you would obey Christ, these are the types of people that we're talking about. Right? And so what we do not see in the New Testament is any kind of condemnation of slavery. Right? We have slaves being told to obey their masters as they would obey Christ. We have Slaves being told to not resist an unjust beating. An unjust beating, right? Which kind of assumes or implies that there will be just beatings. We see house churches that have slaves in them, and everyone's receiving the Eucharist, right? No one's being denied communion for being a slaveholder, because slavery seems to be accepted. I would point out one difference from when we think of slavery in the early modern world and into the 19th century, which is that there's no distinguishing in terms of race at this time. An enslaved person in the Roman Empire might be black, they might be white, any skin color. So that's not a distinguishing element, but they are all foreigners. So being a slave is linked with being a foreigner. So it's not quite race, but it's something similar, right? There's a similar connection there. And I should mention that everything we've been talking about so far is chattel slavery. The word chattel simply means movable property. Movable property. So I can sell you this and you can take it home. This is chattel. This is chattel, right? If you're an enslaved person and I can sell you to somebody else, you are a chattel slave. You are owned as property and can be moved, as opposed to land, right, which is not chattel. Or a serf, if you've ever heard of serfdom, right? They were connected to the land. They were connected to the land, so they weren't chattel. They couldn't be sold and moved. But this was all chattel slavery. So now we're going to very quickly move through the centuries. In the Middle Ages, we see the church continuing to practice slaveholding and to defend it and to put it into our law. The church very much relied upon Roman civil law, the law of the Roman Empire, to guide its own law in Christian countries and to guide some of its canon law. The two would often supplement one another. And so what we will see is that slavery is defended by the popes and by major theologians. For example, Pope Leo the Great. He firmly accepts slavery and in fact makes a law that slaves should not be able to become priests because he says that they would sort of soil the state of the priesthood if they were to become priests. Pope Gregory the Great, doctors of the church, right? Pope Gregory the Great was a slaveholder himself, and he gave slaves to friends as gifts, including children. He gave a baby to a general and said, I ask you to raise him so that in his servitude to you in this life, he will be free in the next. This is Gregory the Great. And then Augustine defends slavery as a just punishment of God upon sinners. And so for Augustine, and if you've ever read certain translations of Augustine's Confessions, bring it out more than others. But Augustine's Confessions, he really envisions his relationship with God as master and slave. And he will talk about God whipping him when he runs away. So really, this is very much central to Augustine's idea, slaveholding. And Aquinas, St. Thomas Aquinas, great medieval theologian, he will defend slavery, very much sticking to Aristotle. He doesn't move into the natural slave aspect, but he defends the idea of one's enslaved status passing from the mother to the children. He defends this as part of sort of an ordered society. And in order to defend slavery, he points to the Old Testament, he points to the New Testament, he points to canon law at the time. We will see both regional and ecumenical councils using slavery as a punishment, and that it is incorporated into our canon law. Most prominently, women who had been living with clergy were to be sold into slavery by the bishop. This was legislation that was implemented by Saint Isidore of Seville. And in ecumenical councils, it was primarily about Christians who assisted Muslims during the Crusades, that they were then to be sold into slavery as a punishment. So we see even chattel slavery as part of canon law and church councils. Again, in Europe at this time, there would have been slaves of many nationalities and skin colors. But again, generally speaking, they would be foreigners. But we've seen something different now, right? Christians in Europe can be punished with slavery. And so it's actually in Christianity where even the foreignness idea goes away. So Christianity actually expands the way by which someone can become a slave. Right? In Europe, in Rome, you couldn't become a slave through punishment. But in Christianity now you can. And there are also Africans who are slaves in medieval Europe. And so really it's it's a very inclusive affair, slaveholding in Christianity in Europe. We will see sometimes in which the popes will condemn specific occurrences of what they call unjust enslavements. This is fully part of the tradition. In the Roman Empire, right, there were 3 ways you can become a slave. And so if you are enslaved outside of one of those 3 conditions, we can say, that is illegal. And the popes would do this from time to time. If free Christians were kidnapped and sold into slavery, they would condemn this. And so you'll sometimes see people refer to pronouncements from medieval popes, and they'll say, oh, look, the popes were against slavery. But if you read the document, you'll see what they're doing is condemning the enslavement of free Christians, of kidnapping someone and selling them into slavery. You were not allowed, that was one of the things you couldn't do. I couldn't just walk up to you and say, you are my slave now, and then kidnap you, right? Especially if you were a free person. And so, and you think, well, that seems like about the same as war, right? But, well, there's a just reason for going to war, et cetera, et cetera. So I could not simply kidnap someone. And that's what the popes will condemn, the kidnappings of Christians. They won't condemn the kidnappings of other non-Christians. So prior to the Atlantic trade, then, we have 1,400 years of Catholic slaveholding in our theology, in our councils, and in our canon law. And I think that's very important to remember as we move into this this period of the slave trade, right? That something unusual is about to occur, but not very unusual, right? There's already African slaves in Europe. There's already all types of people, right? There's already slaves throughout Europe. And there's a very dangerous myth that slaveholding disappeared in Europe during the Middle Ages. It's not true. That is a fiction that was made up by British historians who were trying to prove that Christianity had had a wonderful effect on history and that one of the things it did was get rid of slavery. That's simply not true. That's simply not true. There was always a very robust slave trade around the Mediterranean in particular. And the popes continued to have slaves through the Middle Ages too, especially for papal galleys, for the warships. So now we come to the Atlantic slave trade. In the 1440s, Portugal is sailing around the coast of Africa, and Prince Henry the Navigator is leading this. He is trying to secure Portugal's position on the Iberian Peninsula and secure Portugal's trading and commerce. And so he's looking for trading partners in Africa. And he's looking for, he's heard these rumors of Christian kings of Africa. And he wants to meet some of them and hopefully band together with them to fight the Islamic forces. This is what he wants to do. Well, what he also starts doing is conducting slave raids. Now, that's the one thing that I said you aren't allowed to do. You aren't allowed to go and just kidnap people, right? You aren't allowed to just go and kidnap free people. You have to have a good reason for doing it, like you're at war. But Henry's not at war. He's just going to islands and kidnapping people. And he starts selling them into slavery. Now that seems like the kind of thing then the popes would say, no, don't do that. But in fact, they do the opposite. They approve. So in 1452 and 1455, Pope Nicholas V explicitly gives Portugal the right to take all lands and possessions of non-Christians. Now, he's not moving into heresy in this space. He's using a very specific minority view in canon law at the time that due to Christ's being king of heaven and earth, anyone who's non-Christian doesn't really own their land. And so Christians can dispossess them of that land and take it. If you've ever heard of the doctrine of discovery, these are the documents in which there's a theological connection. There's a theological connection here. So Nicholas V says, well, you can go to war and take all their lands. And naturally, if you're going to war to take those lands, then you can conduct slavery. You can take people and enslave them because you're doing a just war for Christianity. So you can enslave all the people that you meet, and he gives them exclusive trading rights with Africans, including buying slaves. Really, that's to push Spain out. This is a totally political thing. Except he's using the language of Christianity, right, to do this. In fact, he refers to his apostolic authority when he makes these two pronouncements, and invokes the wrath of Peter and Paul upon anyone who opposes it. So these are papal bulls. These are very high authority in which Nicholas V gives this disturbing approval. And then 3 popes renew it explicitly. 3 popes will explicitly renew this approval. They make one exception in terms of Africa, the people on the Canary Islands, because there's this fight between Spain and Portugal over the Canary Islands, and Spain is evangelizing the people there. And so again, you will see a few documents from this period in which the popes condemn the enslavement of Canary Islanders. And again, some people will point to that and say, oh, that's proof that the popes were against the slave trade. No. It's only because Spain was evangelizing them, and they were Christians. And again, you can see this in the documents if you read them closely. In fact, one of the popes who condemned the enslavement of the Canary Islanders was Pope Leo X, who also gave Portugal permission to engage in slave raiding, right? In slave trading. So again, this distinction between you can't kidnap Christians and sell them into slavery, but you can kidnap any other Africans you want to, or buy them from other African tribes. And so that's how this happens. That's how this happens. Because the popes allowed it. They supported it. They supported Portugal. And that begins the Atlantic slave trade. In 1501, Spain will buy enslaved Africans from Portugal and ship them to the New World for the first time. And then, of course, more and more countries will become involved in the slave trade in some way. And by 1866, 12.5 million Africans are forcibly placed on ships to Europe or to the Americas. Only 10.7 million will survive that initial journey. The others die due to mainly disease, but also suicide and homicide, but primarily disease. And of course, canon law, scripture, Roman law, children of enslaved women are considered slaves themselves. And so there are far more victims of the trade than just those 12.5 million. There's millions and millions more, millions and millions more. Now, it would be very nice if we could say, well, those were different times. Nobody knew it was wrong back then. Nobody knew slavery was wrong. What's the big deal? Why are we talking about this? Well, that's not true. That's not true. These are all people before the Atlantic slave trade who argued that slavery was wrong. The opponents of Aristotle, to whom he makes this argument of natural slaves, they believed that slavery was wrong. He says he knows some of them. So there are people in Aristotle's time who argue that slavery is evil. The Essenes and the Therapeutae, we learn from Philo, were against slavery for religious reasons because they believed that all people were brothers and sisters of God, were children of God, and therefore brothers and sisters of one another, so slavery should be wrong. St. Gregory of Nyssa is our only church father that we know of who opposes slavery. He preaches homilies against it. But all the other church fathers in their writings defend slavery, except for Nyssa. There's an abbot named Smaragdus who writes to Louis the Pious, the son of Charlemagne, and says we should forbid slavery in the kingdom. The Carolingians aren't about to do that. And then in the medieval period, though I mentioned that Aquinas defended slavery, St. Bonaventure also defended slavery, but Blessed John Duns Scotus, he's the one medieval theologian who says that it's morally evil. He calls it monstrous that any Christians would be involved in this. And so it's just not true to say that nobody thought slavery was wrong back then. It's documented to be false. There were people that thought it was wrong. But Christianity and the church chose a different path. We chose a different path. Now, likewise, in the slave trade itself, we start having people protesting the trade. Now, first and foremost, we see the enslaved people protesting their enslavement, right? And we see them rebelling, we see them fleeing, protesting, telling their stories. We see enslaved Catholics, so the first baptized enslaved people, and also many of the Congolese who were already Catholic, are rebelling this, and they're even arguing to the Portuguese king that they should be freed, right? And so there's also this terrible argument that you hear sometimes, especially in the United States, we hear this, that, oh, the slaves, they didn't mind. They were happy. They were happy to be slaves, and they had Christian masters. And so it was a very nice life for them. No, again, we have documents showing the opposite, right? People did not like being slaves. It was never fun. It was never nice to be a slave. Some clergy pay attention and listen to them as they are protesting this. And a few, they won't say that slavery is wrong altogether, but they will say that the Atlantic slave trade is operating unjustly. That according to the rules of the church and law, there's something wrong with this Atlantic trade. It's not right. It's not right. They say too many people are being kidnapped. They say that because of European economic demands, African tribes are going and simply kidnapping they're starting wars against other African tribes simply in order to get slaves to meet the European demand. And they'll say, well, the popes couldn't have envisioned that. Couldn't have envisioned that, right? They'll argue that the conditions on the ships are terrible and that therefore this slave trade is unjust. They'll argue about harsh labor, etc. The first European that we know who does this is Father Bartolomé de las Casas in 1547. He at first is okay with the slave trade. He's okay with the Atlantic slave trade until he researches it and comes to believe that the Portuguese don't have a right to be doing what they're doing. And he has to basically ignore the pronouncements of the popes to do this. He even at one point says, well, the Portuguese said that the popes allowed them to do this. I don't know if that's true, he says, right? They couldn't have meant this would be okay. So he has this conversion of the intellect and starts fighting against the slave trade. We have Father Domingo de Soto in 1553 writing against it. We have a Portuguese priest, Fernando Oliveira, in 1555. A Spanish priest in Mexico, in New Spain, Albornoz, in 1573. In 1580, 2 Jesuits in Brazil, in Bahia, tell their community members, because their community owns slaves. The Jesuit community in Bahia owns slaves. And they tell their community that they must get rid of all these slaves, and that everyone in Bahia must get rid of their enslaved people because the slave trade is operating unjustly, right? They're not full abolitionists. They don't think slavery itself is wrong, just that the slave trade is wrong, this slave trade. And they say they will not absolve anyone in the confessional who is a slaveholder and will not give them communion. That includes their Jesuit brothers in the community. And so it's a very bold move. The superior of the community does not like this very much. He calls Rome and says, here, you come down and judge this. And the Jesuit curia removes them from Brazil, from their ministry, and takes them back to Spain and Portugal. And Jesuit slaveholding continues. They made this decision after consulting with a group of theologians who defended the right of these priests to have slaves. One of those, most, in fact, of the most important defenders of the Atlantic slave trade were Jesuit theologians. The most important of these was Molina. If you've ever heard of the theologian Molina. If you're a big nerd like me, then you know that Molina's biggest contribution to theology had to do with nature and grace, and how does God decide who to give grace to, and that's what he's most famous for. But Molina was a very respected theologian at the time, and he writes the first full-length analysis of the Atlantic slave trade. He publishes it with the permission of his superiors, including the Superior General of the Jesuits. He receives the imprimatur. And in it, he says, yes, it is true that some Africans are being simply kidnapped by other Africans and sold into slavery. And they are unjustly enslaved. They are unjustly enslaved, and they should be freed. They should be freed. He says, but the Portuguese were given the rights by the popes to engage in slave trading and to engage in slave raiding, of kidnapping. And so some of these slaves are justly enslaved. They are true slaves. And Molina says, let's imagine that you're in Brazil, or you're in Lisbon, or you're in a slave market in Rome, because there were slave markets in Rome at this time. And you come to the slave market and you see all these slaves. It's probable that some of them are unjustly enslaved and some of them are rightly enslaved, but how are you supposed to know? How are you supposed to know who's simply been kidnapped or who's been correctly enslaved? Well, Molina says, you should investigate, you should ask. You should ask the slave trader, are these people justly enslaved? But guilty until proven innocent. They are to be considered justly enslaved until you can prove that they were simply kidnapped. That they were simply kidnapped. Now, what is the merchant going to say? Right? Oh, yes, this is my stolen property. No. Now, who is the one person that would know if that enslaved person had been justly enslaved or not? The slave himself, right? Molina says, don't believe them, they'll lie. Don't believe them, they'll lie. And so Molina then basically says that it's okay. He says, yes, terrible things are happening in the trade, terrible things are happening, and it would be nice if eventually it were shut down. But until then, you should feel comfortable that as long as you do good investigation, it's okay to buy these Africans. And he will be extremely influential in the history of the trade. Extremely influential. We will see people referring to Molina's work for hundreds of years afterwards. And in fact, Molina creates a new definition of what it means to be a slave. He was very creative. He was a very creative thinker. And that definition becomes so popular that, in fact, I found it among Protestant slaveholders in the southern United States. 300 years later, they're using Molina's definition. So he was very influential, this way of thinking about it. One person who relied upon Molina's thinking was a Jesuit named Alonso de Sandoval. He is a minister to enslaved Africans in Cartagena. He is ministering to enslaved people. And he writes this very long sociological study about enslaved Africans who lived in the Americas. It's actually a really remarkable text. And he shows a lot of sensitivity to understanding, okay, these are people from different nations and different tribes and different customs. And he talks about their language and their habits. And it's really beautiful in quite ways, and in many ways. But unfortunately, at one point, he decides to answer the question of whether the slave trade is okay or not. And he just sort of follows Molina and says, well, Father Molina defended the trade, my superiors defended the trade, so I guess it's okay. He repeats this idea that you shouldn't believe slaves because they're liars. And then he does something really, really bad, really worse, that no one had done so far in their analysis of the slave trade. No Christian had done so far. He starts bringing in racist theories to rationalize it. He says, these are the people, because everybody's nervous at this time. Is this okay that we're doing this? Because we know some people are being kidnapped. Even Molina acknowledged that. Well, how do you defend doing something unjust? You make up reasons. You say, the rules don't apply to these people. He says, this is what Aristotle meant when he said there are some people who are natural slaves. Africans, Aristotle says, they are meant to be slaves. They are naturally slaves. That's what Sandoval says. Sandoval says that these are the descendants of Ham and Canaan who were cursed by God. Which, if you read the Bible, the descendants of Canaan were not the Africans, they were the Canaanites. But he ignores that thought, right? And he says that the way that we know they are cursed is through their black skin. Right? That is a fully racist theory that is being developed in order to defend this grave evil. So it's really it's a terrible thing that Sandoval defends this. He's a minister to these people, right? He's a minister to them. And his disciple and replacement in his mission here to the Africans is St. Peter Claver. Now, Peter Claver is not quite what we may think of him. He, in fact, promotes Sandoval's book. He promotes it. And he is a slave holder himself. Peter Claver buys slaves for his community. This is not revisionist history. If you read any of the early biographies of Claver, it talks about him owning, we know their names. He owned at least 8 or 9 enslaved people, and he was their master for the community. He was the slave master for the Jesuit community there. And he would go and meet them at the ships and everything as they came in, and would baptize them, but then he would buy some of them. He was at times violent and threatening and shaming. He would beat them. He would encourage ones that had run away to turn to their masters with the threat of eternal ruin if they didn't. Because Molina and others had said at this time that running away from your slaveholder is a mortal sin. That running away from your slaveholder is a mortal sin. That was part of the Jesuit theology at this time. And Claver carries all of that out, right? Now, this is very important to note. We already have seen Catholic priests at the time that are protesting the trade, so much that they're removed from their ministry for doing it. Peter Claver never does that. He never protests the trade. He, in fact, legitimizes it by participating in it. And who does the church eventually uplift as the great saint of the slave trade? Not those that protested it, but the one who participated and ministered to those enslaved Africans. It's a very shocking thing if you've never heard this before. But again, this is in the documents. It's in his beatification interviews. They interviewed some of his former slaves. I mean, it's all there. It's all there. Now, again, as I mentioned, there are some priests, and of course enslaved African Catholics, who have been protesting. And that continues. It continues. And they go to Rome. Now they're going to go to Rome. This is one of the most interesting things that I got to research for the book, and it was very personally moving to me. In the 1680s, representatives from Brazilian Black Catholic confraternities go to Rome and beg Pope Innocent XI to condemn the slave trade. Imagine this. They make this journey all the way from Brazil through the Iberian Peninsula and Western Europe into Rome. These two formerly enslaved men, at separate times they go, but and say, please, Pope Innocent, what's happening is terrible. There's a racial hierarchy being built in the Americas. Please condemn this slave trade. Please condemn the slave trade. At the same time, 2 Capuchin priests have been excommunicated and imprisoned by the Inquisition for protesting the trade. And they write these long treatises denouncing the trade. In particular, Epifanio de Moirans, his writing is spectacular. It's spectacular. And they go directly against the Jesuits. They go directly against the Jesuit theologians and say, how dare they be making up these theories? They're simply doing it in order to defend what they want to do, right? And there are these really prophetic, dramatic texts. And they write these and they explain to Rome the trade's many injustices and why the church should condemn it. And nothing happens. Nothing happens. Pope Innocent is disturbed at first. He passes it off to the Curia. There's one cardinal in the Curia who is very upset, and he writes some letters to the nuncios of Portugal and Spain and says, we need to stop this thing, and they write back and say, that's not going to work. And then he just kind of drops it. And a couple years later, there will be a document from the Holy Office, the Congregation of the Doctrine of the Faith, we call it today, or the Dicastery, we call it today, that basically says, keep it legal. Keep it legal. Don't do anything illegal when you're involved in the slave trade. So implicitly they say it's okay to continue, right? Just don't do anything illegal. But they don't answer the challenges, right? They don't answer the challenges that Molina and others posed. So we don't have that papal condemnation that the black confraternities asked for. And so Catholic slaveholding continues. And that's how we get this. Because the popes allowed it. Our theology allowed it. Church law allowed it. That's how this happened. Just as a reminder here, again, people often think of black slavery as a United States issue, right? The United States purchased fewer than 400,000 of the 12.8 million from the slave trade, right? It was the Caribbean, South America, Central America, a much greater share. And of course we have enslaved Africans who went to Europe as well, especially the Iberian Peninsula. We know some went to Rome too. And there was another trade that occurred in Northern Africa. So, the costs are great. Now, one of the things that made the United States a little different was that we sort of kept up this slave breeding, which is how 400,000 at one point moved to, at the end of the Civil War, 4 million. 4 million, right? Because we practiced slave breeding. But again, the church is letting this happen. We approved it at the beginning. We're not fighting against it. But eventually this changes. In the 1800s, abolitionism is strengthening in Europe, including among some Catholics. There's a German bishop in 1817 named Johann Michael Seiler, who writes against slavery. One of the few, they think actually that he might have been the first approved theologian to write for abolitionism, to say that abolitionism was okay. There's others too, you can read about them in the book. And in 1839, Pope Gregory XVI will condemn, at the request of Great Britain, he will condemn the Atlantic slave trade, but not slavery itself. So he does a little bit of what Las Casas did. He doesn't say slavery itself is bad, but he says that this slave trade is operating poorly, is operating badly. He doesn't say that anyone needs to free their enslaved Africans, okay? But he says the trade itself must stop. So he basically does what Britain and the United States have already done. Because in the year 1808, Britain and the United States banned participation in the slave trade, but they don't ban slavery itself, including in their own territories. And so Gregory basically does what the US and Britain have done. But he also falsely claims that the church has always been against the African slave trade. He completely forgets, doesn't mention Nicholas V or any of those popes. He says, we were always against this. We've always tried to stop it. Many of my esteemed predecessors tried to stop this. Now, I don't think that he realized that he was lying. I've seen the documents. I've seen the Vatican file for this document. I think they really believed that. Because as I mentioned, those British historians had written this history of slavery disappearing because of Christianity. Gregory basically lifts that history. I think it was one of those things that people didn't talk about anymore, that the popes had approved this a couple hundred years ago. But Gregory promotes that in his document, this false history. In the year 1866, the Holy Office, the Congregation of the Doctrine of the Faith. This is the year after slavery has been abolished in the United States. They proclaim that slaveholding is morally acceptable and is in no way contrary to Scripture, tradition, or natural law. That is in no way contrary to natural law, Scripture, tradition. It's kind of remarkable to think that we were defending slavery as late as 1866, right? Well, thankfully, we eventually have a pope who changes that. You've heard about him in the news a little bit lately. Pope Leo XIII. Pope Leo XIII. We know that Pope Leo XIII, when he was simply a bishop, he already was an abolitionist. He had written against slavery. He had traveled to the United Kingdom in order to hear Daniel O'Connell speak. Daniel O'Connell, the great Catholic, who fought for the rights of Catholics and the Irish in Parliament, or who fought for the right of Catholics in the British Parliament. He was fighting against slavery. Leo, as a bishop, had gone to hear him speak. He knew about abolitionism. He approved of it. And he is going to publish 2 encyclicals in 1888 and in 1890 that condemn slaveholding as morally evil. He writes this one in 1888 on the occasion of abolitionism in Brazil. Brazil finally is the last country in the Western world, in the Christian world, to forbid slavery, to outlaw it. And he writes this as sort of a celebration of that. And in it, he lays out a whole theology of why slavery is wrong, using the arguments of abolitionists through the centuries. But unfortunately, dear Leo XIII, who I love, I took this picture at his tomb in Rome. He's a great hero of mine because of this, but unfortunately, he also promoted this false history, and he took it up a step. The church was always against slavery itself. He says the church was always against slavery itself. And he uses examples from history, some of those ones that I talked about earlier, the sort of tricky ones. He even says that Gregory the Great was against slavery, even though Gregory the Great was a slaveholder, right? And unfortunately, since this time, since the time of Leo XIII, really the popes have taken up a strong stand against slavery, a strong stand against human trafficking today. But they've also repeated this false narrative that the church was always, at least was always against the slave trade itself, was always against the African slave trade. Maybe we kind of tolerated slavery until then. That's a false narrative that was really promoted by Gregory, more so than Leo, but Leo promoted it too. But this continued. This continued. And so just a summary to close. Our popes authorized the beginnings of the Atlantic slave trade, the African slave trade, and did not withdraw that authorization until nearly 400 years later. The trade caused millions of deaths, stolen labor and lives, physical and sexual violence, and a long legacy of inequality. But in the 19th century, papal documents rewrote the historical narrative to make it seem as if we had always been against slavery, changing the teaching while also changing the narrative. And we still have not reckoned with this history as a church. We've never admitted in any formal way that we were involved in the slave trade, that we approved of the slave trade, or that we changed this teaching and the narrative on it. And so we still need to reckon with this history today. Thank you.
Your job is not done yet. So. Thank you very much, Christopher, for this really impressive, really deep reflection on the history of the church in regard to the slave trade and slavery. Thank you very much for that. I guess all of us here in the room are touched. Let me start with a personal question. How does it come that you have chosen this particular issue, this painful issue? Or maybe this issue has chosen you, but maybe you can tell us a little bit about that.
Yes. Even as a child, I was very interested in the United States history with slavery. I found it very baffling and wondered how, as a Christian nation, we could have done this. And when I joined the Jesuits in 2011, I knew that Jesuits had practiced slaveholding, but I heard a very common refrain, not just among Catholics in the United States, but really throughout the world, that those Jesuits were disobeying church teaching by being slaveholders, right? That was the popular thing that we heard. And then what can you do? You can say, oh, well, people always do that. People disobey church teaching today. It's sin, move along, right? But something about that didn't make sense to me, because I wondered, well, then why weren't they punished? Right? We know that popes would put whole cities and countries under interdict. And I mean, the popes know how to punish, right? Rome knows how to punish people if it wants to. Why didn't any of these, I mean, if they were involved in human trafficking, why in the world didn't the popes ever mention this? And so that just really baffled me. But that was the only, explanation I ever heard was this false narrative that it was just disobeying. And there's in fact still books being published today by apologists that carry this false narrative and just ignore everything that I told you they just ignore everything that I told you there. And they say, no, the church could not have done that. The church couldn't have been wrong. The church couldn't have approved of slavery. It couldn't have changed its teaching. And so it's a very wide narrative today, very popular narrative today. As I said, even the popes, recent popes, have promoted it to some extent. And so this really bugged me. And then when I got to theology studies, I decided I'm finally going to investigate this. And so I wrote every paper for every class on slavery, and I became very obsessed with it. And that's what led to this book.
Thank you very much. So it's not just a distant scientific issue. It's a very personal affair for you. Herr Erzbischof, Sie haben diesem Vortrag zugehört. Ich saß neben Ihnen. Ich konnte förmlich an der Körpersprache spüren, dass Sie das bewegt. Was bewegt Sie, wenn Sie diese Geschichte hören, diese Reflexion?
Ich will zuerst einmal ein Bekenntnis ablegen, dass ich sagen muss, seit ich mich mit dem Thema beschäftige, und das ist noch nicht so lange, seit ich mich vorbereitet habe auf diesen Abend und auf diese Veranstaltung, hat sich da eine Grundhaltung oder ein Bewusstsein verändert. Weil im ersten Augenblick, ganz ehrlich gesagt, dachte ich, okay, ein spannendes Thema, okay, aber ein Exotenthema, haben wir nicht viel schwierigere, viel wichtigere, viel herausfordernde Themen als die Sklaverei und katholische Kirche und die Geschichte dazu. Und ich habe dann in der Beschäftigung mit dem Buch, mit den Themen ganz, ganz viel gelernt und möchte zunächst einmal Father Kellerman wirklich auch ganz herzlich danken für meinen Lernprozess mit dem Buch, für meinen Lernprozess in der Vorbereitung auf heute Abend, aber vor allen Dingen auch jetzt noch einmal diese Eindrücklichkeit zu erleben in Ihrem Vortrag, zu spüren, wie, und das ist, glaube ich, schon so ein erster Gedanke, wie ein Jesuit über die eigene Geschichte spricht. Da spricht ja niemand sozusagen über die Jesuiten, sondern er selbst ist Jesuit und ist damit Teil auch dieser Geschichte. Und das Zweite, was hinzukommt, ich glaube, auch das ist deutlich geworden, der Fokus liegt auf Lateinamerika, aber er ist US-Amerikaner und auch in dieser Hinsicht Teil noch einmal dieser Geschichte und dann zu sehen, ein erstes und natürlich Katholik und Teil dieser Geschichte, ein erster Punkt zu sehen, wie es geht und dass es geht und notwendig ist, sich so mit der Geschichte auseinanderzusetzen, weil die Gegenwart davon kontaminiert, immer noch betroffen, in irgendeiner Form immer noch da ist. Das ist so das allererste. Wie ging es mir noch? Also es gibt so ganz viel, was mir durch den Kopf geht. Ich möchte zunächst mal, vielleicht können wir das ja auch den einen oder anderen Gedanken noch vertiefen. Ich möchte zunächst mal den Gedanken aufbringen, zu sehen, das bewegt mich, wie ein Gedanke aus der Geschichte heraus, aus den eben nicht christlichen, sowieso nicht christlichen, aber auch aus dem biblischen Gedankengut her gar nicht kommt, sondern von Aristoteles herkommt und trotzdem sich die ganze Geschichte des Volkes Gottes mit diesem Gedanken durchzieht, wie das Neue des Christentums nicht die Kraft hat, sozusagen diesen Gedanken auch wirklich durchzusetzen, sondern, wenn ich an Paulus denke, es gibt nicht mehr Sklaven, sondern nur noch Freie, aber die faktische Veränderung es gab so keine faktische Veränderung an der Geschichte, sondern es war eine eher spiritualisierende Grundhaltung. Zu sehen also, wie im Grunde von außen kommend in die Lehrtradition von Kirche dann etwas hineinkommt, was aber auch auf ein Substrat und auf einen Boden trifft innerhalb der Kirche. Und das zunächst einmal zu sehen und sich die Frage zu stellen, wie geht das zusammen? Wenn ich auf heute schaue, wir sind pilgerndes Volk Gottes und wir haben den Schatz unserer Tradition und wir sind gleichzeitig ganz geprägt von der Gegenwart. Und wie geht beides zusammen in kritischer, gegenseitiger Durchdringung? So ein Gedanke, der mich bewegt. Ein anderer Gedanke ist, ich fand es sehr eindrücklich, wie Sie das jetzt eben auch geschildert haben, zu sehen, dass ja es nicht so war, alle waren der gleichen Meinung, es war die gängige Meinung, es war die gängige Weltanschauung, sondern es gab ja auch Theologen, es gab ja auch eine Spur in der Lehre der Theologie, die sehr kritisch und das unterscheidend Christliche in diesem Augenblick auch deutlich formuliert hat. Da zu verstehen, warum es sozusagen dieses unterscheidend Christliche, dieses dagegen sprechen und sich einsetzen für etwas anderes, für das Eigentliche, warum das nicht stärker im Lauf der Geschichte wurde. Womit hängt das zusammen? Und dann auch zu sehen, dass diese Rationalisierungsversuche, man hat ein Gespür im Laufe der Zeit, da geschieht etwas Falsches. Und wie versuche ich das, was ich spüre, dass es eigentlich verkehrt ist, vor mir selbst zu rechtfertigen, indem ich es rationalisiere. Mir kommen dann immer wieder Analogien zu anderen Themen bis in die jüngste Vergangenheit hinein, die mir zeigen, wie schwer ist es anscheinend wahrzunehmen und anzuerkennen, dass man Schuld auf sich geladen hat, dass man sozusagen auf einem falschen Dampfer unterwegs war. Und auch das wäre, glaube ich, nochmal eine Fragestellung, an der man weitergehen kann. Bis dahin diese Fragestellung von Molina, wie komme ich dazu, ob jemand zu Recht versklavt ist? Es war eine ganz merkwürdige Assoziation, die ich heute Abend hatte. Das kann ich nur herausfinden, ob ich einen rechtmäßig oder nicht rechtmäßig versklavten Sklaven bei mir habe, indem ich ihn selbst befrage. Wir beschäftigen uns heute in intensiven Auseinandersetzungen in Europa, jetzt bitte nicht erschrecken, aber mit einem Lieferkettengesetz, bei dem wir eine Frage stellen, wie können wir sicherstellen, dass das, was wir heute nutzen an Produkten, nicht durch unterdrückte Kinderarbeit sozusagen auch kontaminiert ist. Also da ergeben sich für mich sofort ganz neue, aktuelle Fragestellungen. Das andere ist natürlich, ich glaube, mehr als offensichtlich dieses dass man zu einem Wechsel in der Lehrtradition kommt und dann es aber schwerfällt, sozusagen auch sich einzugestehen und anzuerkennen, dass man selbst falsch gedacht und falsch gelehrt hat. Dass man sozusagen sehr spät kommt, also sehr spät kommt, während schon in Nordamerika man weiter war, Sklaverei verboten war, bis man überhaupt zu dem Schritt kommt. Und als man dann zu diesem Schritt kommt, sich sozusagen gefühlt an die Speerspitze setzt und sagt, und bei uns war es schon immer so. Also auch da nochmal ein neues Leugnen und auch damit noch einmal die Frage, wie durch dieses Leugnen auch Schuld auf sich geladen wurde. Ich würde es mal gern bei diesen Dingen, aber es sind bestimmt Punkte, an denen man noch mal vertiefend reingehen kann.
Ja, herzlichen Dank. Sie haben eine ganze Reihe von Punkten schon aufgerissen. Ich würde an einer Stelle nachfassen wollen. Der Umgang mit diesem Erbe, also das toxische Erbe, was wir jetzt hier vor uns haben, über das wir uns im Wesentlichen einig sind. Was wären so für Sie die Leitlinien? Bräuchten wir so etwas wie ein Schuldbekenntnis zum Beispiel? Ein Schuldeingeständnis, um einfach mal die Fakten festzustellen?
Ja, und gleichzeitig zunächst einmal ist das nicht einfach nur ja und dann ist alles gut, sondern mir geht es darum, noch einmal zu gucken, was braucht es denn, dass ein Schuldeingeständnis nicht Gefahr läuft. Damit ist das Thema abgehakt und es ist okay. Denn wir erleben in verschiedenen Zusammenhängen an manchen Stellen fast sogar schon inflationär Schuldeingeständnisse, bei denen wir spüren, und was bewirkt es eigentlich? Das Schuldeingeständnis ist ein wesentliches Element zur Aufarbeitung von Schuldgeschichte. Aber es darf nicht das Einzige sein und es darf erst recht nicht das sein, was sozusagen isoliert für alles andere steht und alles andere wird zurückgenommen. Also zum einen, glaube ich, müssen wir wissen aus verschiedenen Zusammenhängen heraus, denken wir an das extrem schwierige Thema der Aufarbeitung von Schuld in Kirche im Zusammenhang mit sexualisierter Gewalt. Wie viel Zeit braucht es, ob man will oder nicht, um sozusagen fähig zu werden, sprachfähig zu werden in einer Art und Weise, dass man der Sache wirklich gerecht wird? Dass es nicht Schuldverschiebung ist, dass es nicht in irgendeiner Form ins andere Extrem geht, sondern was braucht es, dass ich so darüber sprechen kann und damit auch ein Bekenntnis ablegen kann, dass ich der Sache und der Wucht gerecht werde und gleichzeitig bei anderen nicht Abwehr auslöse, sondern sie mit hineinnehme. Was braucht es, dass das eigene Schuldbekenntnis wahrgenommen wird als Teil einer sehr umfassenden Schuldgeschichte? Also mit einem Schuldeingeständnis, einem Schuldbekenntnis, zum Beispiel durch den Papst, ja, das wäre ein enormes Zeichen. Aber ich glaube, es wäre auch notwendig, dass es eingebunden ist in ein Ganzes. Ja? Was braucht es, dass man sozusagen auch einbinden kann, ein solches Bekenntnis in diesen gesamten Prozess der Veränderung von Lehrtradition? Also es muss sozusagen auch inhaltlich aufbereitet werden, wie es gelingt, dass Lehrtradition etwas gutheißt und zu einem bestimmten Zeitpunkt eine 180-Grad-Wende macht, wie das dann zusammengeht mit der Frage, verliert damit die Lehrtradition Autorität oder gewinnt sie nicht gerade dadurch Autorität, dass sie ein Bekenntnis und damit eine solche Kehrtwende um 180 Grad hinlegt?
Ja, vielen Dank. Es wird sehr, sehr deutlich, hier geht es um ganz grundlegende ekklesiologische Fragen auch um das Selbstverständnis der Kirche. Christopher, do you have any particular ideas how to deal with this toxic heritage? What could be our next steps? what would be your recommendations? And as a Jesuit, could you give us a hint? What are the temptations we are going to meet?
Yeah. Thank you very much for your comments, and yeah, I really appreciate your willingness to engage with the material and with the history, because it's difficult, it's painful, and it's hard, in my opinion, to do that. But I'm so grateful to you for doing so with an open heart. I think that we have a great gift right now in the church of the synod, of synodality, that Pope Francis brought us in terms of bringing people to the table to speak. I would love one day to see a synod on colonialism, slavery, and racism in church history. I think that would be something beautiful for us to do, and to examine how our history has been impacted by these things. I imagine it, though, something that I often think about is the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission after apartheid. Of course, that was this history isn't quite as recent, but it's not that long ago, right? In 1888, there were still Catholic slaveholders in Brazil. That's not that long ago. And so I think that being able to have some time where the history is told and put out there, because this is something, and in a way like the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa, or I'm sure that this room, that you all know so many different ways of dealing with the history of Nazism and the Holocaust, and the difficulty of reconciling with that. I mean, I would suspect that you all have real expertise in how something could be done well, and I think that we would have to all come together to do that, to think about that. And of course, major players in that conversation would have to be the descendants of those who were enslaved, right? The African diaspora, and including Black Catholics. Black Catholics in the United States, Black Catholics in Colombia, Black Catholics in Brazil, and to talk about how this has impacted their lives, to talk about the discrimination that they face even in the church today, and of course in the societal inequality, right? And so I think having us all there to listen to the descendants, and also, this isn't a history that's widely known. And so it's something that needs to be taught. It's something that needs to be part of our own telling of our own story, right? Right now it isn't. And so I think that's really the main thing, is that we need the truth to be out there. And whenever I give this talk in the United States, a talk like this one, and there are Black Catholics in the audience, and it gets to this period, almost without an exception, they all say, yes, conversations about reparations are good. Those are good conversations to have, but we just want people to believe us that this happened and to know the truth. We just want the truth to be out there and accepted. And that if the church could just do that even, what a great step it would be. What a great step that it would be. And I think the temptation is to, as the Archbishop said, is to say that, well, this was long ago in the past. There's more pressing things to look at today. That's a temptation. And even if there are more pressing things to look at today, well, we can do more than one thing, right? We're all very sharp people. We can talk about more than one thing at a time in our lives, That's a big temptation. Another temptation is to just say it's too painful, so we don't want to look at it, And I hear that a lot, even in my own order. And of course, it wasn't just the Jesuits, right? Dominicans were slaveholders, Franciscans were slaveholders, Capuchins, diocesan priests, popes. I mean, this is, it's very painful to look at, and sometimes when history is too painful, we can just say, I don't want to look at it anymore. I want to think about something else. And then the wounds stay, and the wounds fester.
Thank you. Herr Erzbischof, Sie wollten auf die Frage der Synodalität reagieren.
Ich würde tatsächlich gerne noch ergänzen. Der Gedanke, dass ein Schuldbekenntnis, eine Anerkennung in dieser Form ein wesentlicher Schritt, ein wesentliches Moment ist, aber nicht isoliert stehen darf, sondern flankiert sein muss. Father Kellerman hat es gerade eben gesagt, ist für mich noch einmal deutlich zu wissen und zu erkennen, was hat das denn eigentlich, dieses Thema, für eine Relevanz und für eine Auswirkung auf das Heute? Ich erinnere mich sehr gut an mein allererstes deutsch-afrikanisches Bischofstreffen in Madagaskar. Wir hatten über Themen die Entwicklung der Familie, Rollenverhältnis von Mann und Frau diskutiert, und in diesen Diskussionen gab es an einer Stelle fast etwas Disruptives, einen Ausbruch von einem afrikanischen Bischof, als es auch um die Gewährleistung und die Bewilligung von Projektvorgaben gab, mit welchen Auflagen Projekte versehen sind, dass wir Projekte fördern und unterstützen mit unserem Geld im Blick auf Frage nach Empfängnisverhütung und. Und ein Bischof dann plötzlich explodiert ist und gesagt hat, wir spüren in diesem Moment, in solchen Momenten, von bestimmten Hilfsorganisationen, dass es wieder euch in Europa darum geht, über uns zu bestimmen, wie wir zu denken haben. Und diese Erzählung, also dieses Erleben auf Madagaskar, das war für mich das erste Mal so dieses hautnahe Erleben, wie sehr diese Verwundung, wie tief diese Verwundung ist und bis in die Gegenwart hinein plötzlich spürbar ist. Und ich glaube, bestimmte Fragestellungen, die wir innerhalb unserer Kirche haben und diese ganz große Chance, die auch durch die Weltsynode dann in diesem gesamten Konsultationsprozess möglich war, hat uns ja auch wiederum gezeigt, wie notwendig es ist, dass wir nicht nur ein Schuldeingeständnis machen, sondern dass wir daraus auch zu einer neuen, anderen Art des Umgehens, des Aufeinanderhörens, des Miteinanderverstehens, des Hören wollen, des Lernen wollen und damit auch des Anerkennens und des Glaubens gehen wollen. Also von daher ist, glaube ich, auch der Gedanke der Synodalität in einem weltumfassenden Kontext, wie es Papst Franziskus initiiert hat, hilft auch, bestimmte weltkirchliche Dynamiken, die ihren Ursprung in dieser geschichtlichen Erfahrung haben, neu anzugehen und neu zu verstehen. Das meinte ich vorhin. Es kommt nicht einfach nur auf diesen isolierten Akt eines Schuldbekenntnisses an, sondern es braucht die Bereitschaft, Geschichte anzuerkennen, wie sie ist, sie nicht schön zu reden und gleichzeitig Bildung, Vermittlung, um zu verstehen zu können, was sind denn heute für Dynamiken im Spiel, die letztendlich ihre Urwunde in diesen geschichtlichen Erfahrungen haben.
I have the feeling, Chris, that you agree. Reading your body language, it's not so complicated.
No, certainly. And I think that as you mentioned in terms of seeing this in the whole picture, the colonial mindset of how Western nations can still find themselves exercising that, and how we need to move away from that. The way that the colonial mindset, I think, can impact even the church in our theology, right? Of maybe trusting European theology and the European theological tradition, but looking at, let's say, the Latin American theology with suspicion, or indigenous Catholics and saying, their images of Christ, they're pantheist, right? Oh, let's ignore Francis of Assisi and everything he said, because he was European, that was okay, right? I mean, there's a colonial mindset that we can get sometimes in the church that can be very dangerous. And so I think examining all that together, and again, and how it impacts the way that we do things today is very significant. And I like what you said earlier, Archbishop, about not just listening, but also having fertile ground in preparation to listen. Because it would be nice if in the history we were to have seen that anyone who ministered to enslaved Africans heard their stories and changed. But that's not true. That's not true. Peter Claver and Sandoval, they listened to the stories of enslaved Africans, and they didn't believe them, or they decided that they knew better, right? They knew better. There wasn't fertile ground there, as there were for others. And so I think that that's something that we have to do in synodality in the church today too, as we listen, is to really be open to conversion, to really be open to where is the Holy Spirit in this moment, and to not immediately assume that it's with me. And in the history of the church's teaching of slavery, seeing that there were times when the truth was not coming from the places that we are trained to look for it. But it was still there. It was still there. I think that when I think about this history, of course, I'm like every other scholar that thinks that, their research is what will save the world and the church. And everybody should be interested in it. But I really do believe that examining this history as a church would not only bring some healing and new creative options and solutions to the problems of racism and colonialism and inequality today, but it would also help us as a church to provide a stronger evangelical witness in the world and to think a little bit more deeply about teaching and authority, because there's some real theological challenges in this history. And we can just ignore them and hope they go away, but they won't, right? I think it could really, I would argue that this history shouts for the need for synodality, because it was a time in history when the theology of the marginalized eventually became the teaching of the church. And so this could maybe show us a way to get there.
Thank you. Ich denke, es ist deutlich geworden, insofern müssen wir das gar nicht groß vertiefen, dass wir hier nicht über eine sehr distanzierte historische Frage reden. Wir reden nicht über die persischen Kriege, die sind auch interessant, aber die sind nicht prägend für die Situation heute, sondern es wird deutlich, wie viel Anwesenheit diese Geschichte heute hat. Für mich selber war in Ghana die Teilnahme der Afrokolumbianer extrem eindrucksvoll, weil es wurde so deutlich, dass das Fehlen der Erinnerung in Kolumbien über das Schicksal der Versklavten korrespondiert mit der schwierigen sozialen Situation und der Menschenrechtssituation der Afrokolumbianer heute. Hier gibt es einen Zusammenhang zwischen fehlender Erinnerung und Menschenrechtssituation, mit der wir da heute umgehen müssen. Aber bevor wir zu so einer Frage kommen, was ist der Zusammenhang zwischen dieser Erinnerung und dem Kampf gegen moderne Sklaverei, würde ich gerne mal eine konkrete katholische Frage platzieren. Herr Erzbischof, Sie haben ganz zutreffend und plastisch gemacht, es geht nicht einfach nur um eine Selbstentlastung mit einem Schuldbekenntnis, sondern es geht um eine tiefere Transformation und eine neue Form von Beziehungsgestaltung. Nun haben wir die Ikone Peter Claver, 9. September, der Apostel der Sklaven. Was machen wir damit? Wie gehen wir mit diesem, ich sage mal, sehr katholischen Erbe um? Haben Sie da Ideen, Ansätze?
Also jetzt drücke ich mich ein bisschen, weil ich eigentlich gerne die Frage gleich weiterreichen möchte, zuerst einmal an den Jesuiten. Und zwar wirklich aus einer Frage heraus, wie geht denn nach all der Erkenntnis der Jesuitenorden mit seinem jesuitischen Heiligen heute um? Vielleicht hilft uns das auch noch einmal zu denken, wie wir damit umgehen. Ich drücke mich nicht davor, ich würde gerne erst einmal was hören, wenn es okay ist.
Well,
Father
from the Jesuits is always a fine idea. So.
I hope. I count on you.
The truth of the matter is that the Jesuit order, the Society of Jesus, has not admitted this either. The Society of Jesus in the United States has tried to engage with its own history with slavery, and has connected with the descendants of enslaved people. We've done that on a local level, which I think is a good thing. It's a very good thing. But the Society of Jesus universally has not. And the Society of Jesus, its primary journal in Rome, I never pronounce it correctly, but La Civiltà Cattolica, a journal that we had in Rome, that we still have today in Rome. In the 1860s, we were defending slavery in the United States. It was really as late as then that the Society of Jesus was still condemning was still defending slavery. And after the assassination of Abraham Lincoln and the end of slavery in the United States, that journal, a year later, I think because people saw in Italy, Abraham Lincoln became like a big hero after his assassination, and people in Italy and in Rome just loved him and really thought of him as this great freedom fighter. The Jesuit journal then published an article saying that the Society of Jesus had always fought for the side of the slave. And it always shone the way through people like Peter Claver, who ministered to the enslaved people against the cruel Portuguese and Spanish masters. And that they even say that our theologians like Molina condemned the trade. So the Society of Jesus is just as much a part of this lie, and we've never dealt with it. We've never dealt with it. We've never admitted the truth about Claver. We've never admitted that we once had over 20,000 enslaved people at one time. And so there's a need for a true historical reckoning with us too. And I hope that one day we will. Peter Claver always sends the biggest shocks in an audience when I mention it. And there's, the Knights of Peter Claver in the United States is a very important association of African-American Catholics, primarily African-American Catholics. I'm also a member of the Knights of Peter Claver because I ministered at an African-American Catholic parish for 2 years. And so I would want to ask them, what do you all think we should do with the legacy of Peter Claver, right? And Black Catholics in Cartagena, right? It's a very difficult situation. It's a very difficult situation. But at the end of the day, I also don't blame it all on Peter Claver, right? Because that still is a scapegoat. When the truth is, the superior general in Rome was allowing him to do this, and the Pope was allowing the superior general to do this, right? It was all part of a much wider context than just Peter Claver. And so the one thing that I will say is that you have these saints that fall off their pedestals, like Gregory the Great or Peter Claver. But then you have new heroes, right? We have new heroes like Gregory of Nyssa. You have new heroes like those Capuchins that were imprisoned, those Jesuits in Brazil, right? You have new heroes like those Black Catholic confraternities who went all the way to Rome to fight for their freedom. And so that's something I think that can give us hope too, as we look at a different portrait, a different picture, a different history of some of these saints like Peter Claver, to remember that there's also new saints. There's also new saints that we can celebrate. You know.
Thank you.
Ich würde von meiner Seite aus gerne dazulegen, genau dieses Ringen macht es nämlich deutlich. Und ich möchte das jetzt nicht verstanden wissen, dass ich sozusagen das irgendwie einebne oder egalisiere, sondern ein erster Gedanke, Heilige sind aus bestimmten Gründen selig oder heilig gesprochen worden. Das ist nie ein Urteil über vollkommene moralische Reinheit, sondern wir haben in der ganzen Geschichte sehr viele Heilige, die moralisch in bestimmten Verhaltensweisen deutlich hinterfragt werden müssen und sollen. Es kann eine Chance sein, auch nochmal genauer hinzuschauen, was ist denn das Eigentliche daran, an Peter Claver, was gibt es denn in all dieser sozusagen dunklen Geschichte dann für einen Glaubensverdienst, das in den Blick genommen werden kann. Das ist das Erste. Das Zweite ist, wir müssen uns immer auch noch einmal bewusst machen, unser Urteil geschieht über eine große Distanz hinweg, mit sehr viel Wissen und sehr viel weiterentwickelten Blick, auch geistesgeschichtlich von einer anderen Warte heraus. Und wir müssen immer auch gucken, in welchem Kontext ist sozusagen eine Heiligsprechung, Seligsprechung vollzogen worden. Ja? Auch das erklärt es nicht. Das Dritte für mich ist die Grundsatzfrage, die ich vorhin schon einmal angesprochen habe. Müsste das nicht auch noch einmal zu einer veränderten Form über unser Sprechen, von unserem Sprechen über Selige und Heilige führen? Mindert es die Autorität, wenn ich sagen kann, da gibt es ein dunkles Kapitel? Also ist das sozusagen, ist dann jemand komplett vom Sockel gestoßen, in einer gewissen Weise ganz bestimmt? Aber nimmt es nicht auch stärkt es nicht auch noch einmal den Punkt zu sagen, trotz all dem gibt es da etwas, wofür er eigentlich gewertschätzt wird. Ich kenne zu wenig die Gesamtverdienste von Peter Claver, wie sie in den Selig- oder Heiligsprechungsakten formuliert werden. Ja? Aber die Grundfrage dahinter steckt immer, ist erst dann jemand sozusagen in dieser Anerkennung, in dieser Wertschätzung, wenn es eine blütenreine Weste gibt? Oder gehört nicht zu diesem Verehren eines Glaubensvorbildes auch die Ehrlichkeit dazu, zu sagen, und hier steht jemand auch in Schuldzusammenhängen? Das ist ja vielleicht auch nochmal eine eigene Frage, auf die wir gehen müssen. Wie ist das denn erklärbar, was persönliche Schuld im Umgang mit Sklaverei ist und was sozusagen das Eingebundensein in erkenntnistheologische Zusammenhänge oder auch in systemische Zusammenhänge, die dann wiederum, man könnte es den erbsündlichen Zusammenhang auch beschreiben, die dann auch nochmal ein anderes Licht drauf werfen, ohne etwas zu entschuldigen. Aber ich glaube, in dieser differenzierten Form brauchen wir grundsätzlich einen Blick auf das, was heilig oder selig heißt nie absolute moralische Reinheit.
Chris.
Yeah, thank you. And I think that, if I were to try to, I don't think that Peter Claver should be decanonized, uncanonized. I think that the difficulty with Peter Claver is that there is a narrative, a false narrative, either one, that he was against slavery, which, by the way, Pope Francis said that. Pope Francis once said that, very few people were against slavery at that time. Peter Claver was one of them, he said. So again, the Jesuits don't know our own history, even the Holy Father. And so there's this false narrative that must be corrected, right? Because, and what we also don't want to do is say, well, So let's say we correct the narrative, right? And say, no, he was not against slavery. He wasn't against it. He was a slaveholder, and we promote that. Then the second temptation is to say, well, he had no other options. He was working within the system that was given to him. But that's not true. He didn't need to buy enslaved people, right? Now, all that being said, the truth is there's a bigger historical context in which the Catholic Church is saying this is okay, and Peter Claver is part of the most hierarchical, obedient, structured religious order in the Catholic Church. And so to put all of the blame on him is crazy, right? We have to see the bigger issue here. And to see, though, that both Peter Claver and the Catholic Church had other options available to them, which they did not choose. They could have chosen the way of Las Casas. They could have chosen the way of those two Jesuits in Brazil. They could have chosen the way of the Capuchins, right? But we didn't, and that was our moral failure as a body, as an organization. And I fear that by exalting Peter Claver as the saint of racial justice and the slave trade, we're washing our hands of it. So that's why I don't think he should be decanonized, but I do think that we need to point toward other heroes, other saints of the trade. Now, do I believe that Peter Claver is in heaven? Yes. Because like you said, I mean, he was part of a social fabric where social sin was very deep within it, and deep within the church and the church's theology at the time. What he did possess in virtue was a deep zeal and passion for the salvation of the people under his charge, including enslaved people. And that's where we can admire him and say he deeply wanted them to be saved and to be in heaven. The ways that he went against it, or the ways that he went about evangelizing, are not a good model for today's evangelization. So we can still look at his virtue there. But would I call him a saint of the slave trade? No. He maybe is a saint, but he's not the saint of the slave trade, if that makes sense, you know? And so I will still offer his mass on his feast day, but I don't think of him as being a prophet of racial justice. There were others that are more adequate for that, you know? And that, again, is really a problem of the church, not a problem of Peter Claver. Who do we choose to focus on? Who do we choose to exalt? Why did we choose to excommunicate some and make others saints? Right? It's a choice of the church. And so what I love, too, about what you said, Archbishop, is that it makes us think more about what is real sanctity and what is the effect of canonizing someone. What does it say to the world today when we canonize someone? And also being humble enough to say, okay, well, this guy that the church canonized, you know, however many hundreds of years ago, doesn't really fit our model of holiness today, and that's okay. But what can we learn? What can we learn from it?
Es wird ganz deutlich, da sind sehr viele Fragen, die wir hier weiter diskutieren könnten. Und die Versuchung ist stark, das einfach zu tun. Meine Großmutter, eine sehr kluge Frau, hat mir irgendwann mal gesagt, mein Junge, mach keine Versprechen, die du nicht bereit bist zu halten. Und ich habe am Anfang gesagt, ich werde mich bemühen, dass Sie die Chance haben, zumindest ein paar Fragen einzubringen. Wenn Sie jetzt die Gelegenheit ergreifen wollen, Fragen zu stellen, dann bitte ich um Handzeichen. Frau Schneider hat ein Mikrofon, mal ist da.
Also mir kam etwas zu kurz, die Verwobenheit zwischen weltlicher, säkularer Macht und kirchlicher Macht. Repräsentiert durch den obersten Führer, den Papst und so weiter. Und diese Verwobenheit, ich will das ein Beispiel nennen, für Deutschland verhängnisvoll immer noch gültiges internationales Recht. nämlich das Konkordat, eingeleitet durch Papst Pius XII. Und der hat, ja, beziehungsweise die Aufgabe gab es dann von Papst Johannes der 23., der hat versucht, quasi nach etwa 20, 30 Jahren ein Stück weit das aufzuarbeiten. Leider ist er früh verstorben. Sein Nachfolger Paul VI. Muss das übernehmen. Und der stand dann vor der Frage der Heterogenität innerhalb, zumindest auch der europäischen Kirche. Man denke nur an den Kardinal in Frankreich, Lefebvre und so weiter. Und dieses Zusammenhalten des gesamten Blocks von Weltkirche und entsprechende diverse moralische Ansprüche, die auch dann auch noch kulturell unterschiedlich geprägt sind im Laufe der Jahrhunderte. Diesen Aspekt, also, und in Deutschland hat man das eine Sondersituation des sogenannten Dualismus zwischen Kirche und Staat über mehr als 1000 Jahren. Also diesen Aspekt würde ich gerne auch noch wissen, dass man darauf antwortet.
Wer von Ihnen beiden fühlt sich angesprochen?
Einen ersten Gedanken dazulegen. Ich glaube, man muss immer betrachten, was ich am Anfang versucht habe, mit dem Begriff des unterscheidend Christlichen auch deutlich zu machen. Kirche ist immer Pilgerin durch die Zeit und ist damit verwoben mit all den Bedingungen, zeitgeschichtlichen Bedingungen. Und damit auch verwoben in unterschiedlicher Intensität zu unterschiedlichen geschichtlichen Epochen mit einer weltlichen Macht ausgestattet, als mit einer rein geistlichen Macht. Kirche ist nie die reine Kontrastgesellschaft, sondern sie ist immer Teil der Gesellschaft gewesen und hat von daher auch nicht nur funktioniert, sondern auch gedacht in diesen Momenten. Genau das ist die Herausforderung aber für uns als Kirche, uns diese Abhängigkeiten auch von zeitgeschichtlichem, von Gegenwart, von all den Dingen, uns das deutlich zu machen und uns immer wieder auch selbstkritisch die Frage zu stellen, in unserem Verhalten, in unserem Handeln, auch in unserer systemischen Situation, in der wir stehen. Ja? Wo kommt darin das unterscheidend Christliche zur Welt, zur Gegenwart, zu den gängigen Überzeugungen, zu den üblichen Meinungsbildungen? Wo kommt darin das eigentlich unterscheidend Christliche zum Tragen? Nicht im Gedanken einer sozusagen einer heilen, perfekten kleinen Gruppe, die als Kontrastgesellschaft anders unterwegs ist als andere. Wir bleiben immer verwoben und können uns gar nicht aus dieser zeitgeschichtlichen Bedingtheit herauslösen. Keiner von uns kann das. Wir sind immer auch mit unseren Urteilen heute zeitgeschichtlich bedingt. Und ich bin da immer sehr, sehr vorsichtig und zurückhaltend, weil ich mir die Frage stelle, wie wird man eigentlich mal in 50, in 60, in 70 Jahren über unser Verhalten, über unsere Position, die wir eingenommen oder eben nicht eingenommen, das, was wir heute nicht ausreichend gesehen haben, wie wird man darüber urteilen? Für mich ist so ein Punkt, vielleicht kann ich es noch einbringen, das bewegt mich schon über viele Jahre, begleitet es mich. Ich glaube, es ist bei Jeremia, dieser biblische Satz, in Jeremia wird es als Sprichwort bezeichnet, unsere Väter haben saure Trauben gegessen und uns wurden die Zähne stumpf. Ja? Also das ist für mich nicht einfach nur etwas, um mit dem Zeigefinger auf Geschichte zu zeigen und zu sagen, und heute weiß ich es besser, sondern gleichzeitig kritisch, selbstkritisch zu sein und wodurch werden den nachfolgenden Generationen durch meine sauren Trauben, die ich esse, die Zähne stumpf, um in diesem Bild zu bleiben. Das heißt dann aber auch mit einer gewissen Demut an das Ganze dran zu gehen, aber heißt nicht, es nicht anzugehen. Und zu sagen, man kann halt nichts ändern, es sind immer zeitgeschichtliche Verwobenheiten, sondern ja, wann immer wir zu einem Erkenntnisfortschritt und zu einer klareren Auffassung gekommen sind, dann braucht es auch den Mut und die Entschiedenheit, das zu benennen. Und gleichzeitig zu wissen, auch mein Handeln und mein Denken ist kontextbedingt eingeschränkt.
Well, as an obedient Jesuit, I guess you do agree. Yes.
I can't add anything because that was very beautiful.
Yes.
I love that image of the sour grapes, and yeah, absolutely. Thank you.
Could you raise your hand so that my colleague...
Thank you very much for your presentation and also for your clear language. I like the idea of changing the narrative because so many things have been covered over time. But my question to you, sir, is this. All that we've heard over centuries, is it not based on ideology? You made mention of Aristotle, for example, what he brought about. Is it not ideology and philosophy conflicted probably with theology and missiology that formed a particular foundation that have been built on over time to look at certain group of people through that lens and other group of people in a particular lens, and so we have this dichotomy until today. So if we have to change the narrative, I applaud that. Shouldn't we go down to the roots to also change some of the perspective, the ideology, and theology to do a proper job today? Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Yes, that's an excellent question, and I can only affirm it because, sometimes I get asked, why did the church do this? And I have to say, the question is not why did the church do this? There were 10,000 decisions that were made by people, by theologians, by philosophers, and so you can't just point to one thing. And that sort of building of the culture, the theological and philosophical culture that led to that context, we do have to look at the roots of it. And unfortunately, some of those roots do go all the way to Scripture. And that's an extremely difficult question to ask. That's a painful question to ask. And so I'm going to ignore that one today. But when we think about, for example, like you mentioned, Aristotle, right? We see that this idea of natural slavery, even though there were people at Aristotle's time who rejected it, there were ways in which it got into our theology at times. And I think we then have to say, okay, are there maybe other aspects of Aristotle's way of thinking that we need to reevaluate that have entered into our theology, right? Or in order to sort of acknowledge the problem with Scripture, without, again, pointing fingers or saying this is revelation or this isn't. I don't want to get into that. But could we at least say that maybe there are certain teachings that we take from Scripture that we take inappropriately in terms of how we use them today? And then, I mentioned earlier how Melina said, don't believe the slaves, they'll lie, right? And that this became a really popular way of thinking about this. What did that also train people to do? Don't believe black people. They are liars. They lie, they steal, they are lazy. And remember during the Black Lives Matter protests a few years ago, we had black people saying, don't you believe us? This happens all the time, right? So even those little tiny things in theology take root and cause these racist ideas and behaviors. And so there's so much that cries out for reform, that cries out for us, and especially, again, I think this is where the question you just asked really roots with what the Archbishop was saying. We don't need to judge the moral culpability of people in the past, right? Even when I talk about Peter Claver, I'm never going to judge his moral culpability. It just doesn't. Only God does that, and we hope that God shows mercy on all of us. And that's not the lesson to be learned. The lesson to be learned is, how do I do that today? How do I still sin today? How do I not listen to people who are marginalized and the victims of oppression today? And what are the inbuilt ideas that cause me to do that? You know? And to me, really what that sticks to the heart of is, how does the church today shed itself of those things so that we can be an authentic witness to the gospel of Christ? The gospel of Christ that also states that he has come to set captives free and bring liberty to the oppressed.
Wann immer und wo immer wir uns unserer eigenen Herkunft und Geschichte und auch den dunklen Seiten unserer Geschichte nicht stellen, bleibt es ein gärendes Gift für die Gegenwart und die Zukunft, sich der ganzen Wahrheit oder so weit wie möglich es Wahrheit gibt, zu stellen. Das bleibt ein gärendes Gift für die Zukunft. Das erleben wir in so vielen anderen Zusammenhängen. Ich habe es vorhin schon einmal ganz kurz angedeutet. Was war das für ein schwieriger, für ein schmerzhafter Prozess wahrzunehmen, wie die Zusammenhänge, auch die Schuldzusammenhänge in einem Dritten Reich waren? Was sind das für schwierige, enge Zusammenhänge im Zusammenhang mit unserem dunklen Kapitel des Umgangs mit sexualisierter Gewalt? Wann immer all das eben nicht wahrgenommen und aufgegriffen wird, ja, bleibt es ein Gift, das unser gegenwärtiges und unser zukünftiges Handeln kontaminiert und vergiftet. Und deswegen geht es nicht darum, sozusagen um Aufarbeitung der Geschichte, um ein Urteil über damals zu fällen. Das ist sozusagen notwendig, aber es geht darum, daraus handlungsfähig, unterscheidungsfähig zu sein für das Jetzt. Und ich möchte noch einen anderen Gedanken dazulegen zum Umgang mit Schuld, mit Versagen, mit geschichtlichem Versagen oder auch mit persönlichem Versagen. Wann immer wir davon sprechen, dass jemand Schuld eingesteht, steht sofort auch die Frage im Raum, wie ernsthaft, wie echt ist das? Woran erkenne ich, dass jemand ernsthaft und Schuld bekennt? Indem er sozusagen Reue zeigt. Das ist ganz alte, klassische Theologie. Worin besteht denn, woran erkenne ich denn, dass jemand Reue zeigt? Indem er im Hier und Jetzt etwas anders macht, als es vorher war. Und genau das müsste eigentlich der Zusammenhang sein, warum dieses Thema von damals etwas ist, wenn wir wirklich sehen, wie wir auch als Kirche, aber nicht nur als Kirche daran schuldig geworden sind, dass wir zeigen, wir werden heute glauben. Denen glauben, die Opfer geworden sind. Wir werden heute zu einem anderen Umgang, zu einem anderen Anerkennen, zu einem anderen Hinhören, zu einem anderen Hineinnehmen finden, als es damals war. Wir werden heute mit dazulernen, dass wir Autorität nicht verlieren, wenn wir Fehler eingestehen, sondern dass unsere Autorität gewinnt, auch unsere Glaubwürdigkeit der Welt gegenüber, wenn wir gleichzeitig sagen können, und da gibt es Versagen und da gibt es Schuld. All diese Dinge, das ist das, worauf ich sage, es ist kein Exodenthema Und es geht nicht darum, mit dem Finger auf die Vergangenheit zu zeigen, sondern es geht darum, sehen, was ist, damit ich zeigen kann, ich will und wir können heute in einer anderen Weise in die Zukunft gehen und Gegenwart gestalten.
Vielen Dank, Herr Erzbischof. Ihre beiden Redebeiträge entheben mich der Notwendigkeit, ein Schlusswort zu versuchen, weil wirklich die wesentlichen Dinge, die am Ende eines solchen Gesprächs gesagt werden können, von Ihnen beiden in vortrefflicher Weise gesagt worden sind. Ich denke, es wird sehr deutlich. Wir haben es hier mit einem offenen Themenbereich zu tun, der uns sehr viel weiterbringen kann in unseren Beziehungen zueinander, aber auch in unserem Verständnis unserer selbst als pilgernde Kirche durch die Geschichte. Und das tuend kann es ein produktiver Beitrag eben auch sein zu den großen Verletzungen, die es in der Welt gibt, Umgang mit dem Kolonialismus, Rassismus, indem wir vielleicht einen Beitrag leisten, der versucht, einen Horizont einer Besserung aufzuzeigen. Dementsprechend bleibt mir im Wesentlichen jetzt zu danken. Ihnen, Herr Erzbischof, dass Sie mit Ihrem sehr, sehr engen Terminplan nach Berlin gekommen sind, um dieses Gespräch zu führen. Ein wichtiges Zeichen der hörenden, aber auch der diskutierenden Kirche, die sich in die Verantwortung nehmen lässt. And of course, very much to you, Christopher. It is a tremendous contribution that you have written this book and that you are now traveling around the planet to sell the truth to the people. I remember the moment when you finished your presentation in Ghana. We were sitting in this fortress, and it was absolute silence. And it was a moment, truth coming home. Truth coming home. It was a feeling of pain and liberation in the same moment. And thank you very much for that. And we are still within this process, bringing truth home and encouraging ourselves to become witnesses to what we have to be witnesses of. Thank you very much for this. All the best and God bless for your journeys. I know tomorrow you will go to Munich and then to Luxembourg. The same show like here, but with Kardinal Hollerich in Luxembourg, because it's important. We have to spread it. But this is not the end of these things. You know, this wouldn't be a Catholic event if there wouldn't be some drinks outside and something to eat. So feel welcomed to continue the conversation, and thank you very much.